Hi, everyone. We are the Wearable Sensor Group, and I'm CT, and I'm an environmental science major and also a senior.
I'm Christina. I'm a communications major and a junior.
My name is Filimon Kiros. I'm from the Environmental Health Science Department, and I'm a graduate student.
My name is Ben Lazan. I'm a computer science senior. I'm an undergrad.
Right, so CT and I focused on blue light, and then they focused on ozone sensors. So our project is called Project Scuba, and we will explain that later. Our project goal was essentially to measure the amount of blue light we encounter on a daily basis, how many hours per day, at what intensities and wavelengths, and how our smartphones impact this exposure, and to create a wearable device that filters and detects blue light using Arduinos. Why blue light? Blue light naturally comes from the sun. It regulates your circadian rhythm, which is your sleep-wake cycle. It boosts alertness, heightens reaction time, and elevates your mood. However, artificially, it comes from cell phones, laptops, screens, fluorescent lights, LED lights, which, if used during nighttime, can disrupt your sleep cycle, cause eye strain and dry eyes, headaches, and in more serious cases, macular degeneration, and suppress your melatonin production. Also, safe amounts of blue light are used in studies to help with seasonal affective disorder and Alzheimer's. And this is the range we're looking at. Blue light goes from around 400 to 500. However, we wanted to look at 450 to 470, which is caused by screens and LEDs.
Here's a slide showing the wavelengths of natural and indoor lighting, and you can see that there is a huge disparity between the wavelength intensities across different types of lights. In particular, we really want you to look at the fluorescent graph, because that's one of the lighting sources that we use in our experiment. And here's just a graph also showing the wavelengths of electronics in smartphones, and you can see that the wavelength intensities in blue light is really high. Here's just another graph showing that the peak for the wavelength intensity is highest in the blue light range for different smartphones. And here's an interesting graph that shows as the versions of iPads improve, the blue light intensity also increases.
So our device itself, we use an Arduino Uno board with a photocell, which detects light, measures in lux, which is brightness. So at the darkest, it should be around 0. At the brightest, it should be around 1023. And a 10K ohm resistor. We found all our plans for wiring and the code at this source online. The code specifically, the only thing we changed was the delay function. We changed it to about a second. So every second, it will print out a measurement of the lux.
We looked at a variety of filters in order to see how the photocell responded. And before we determined what length of wavelength that we wanted to look at, we wanted to see if the sensor was working properly. So we basically, on the picture on the left, you can see different colored cups. We basically just used dry erase markers and colored it. And then we found that when we put that over the sensor, the lux, there was a lux range for each of them. So that's when we know the sensor was working properly. And then there was also a disparity between what the unit of measurement for the photocell and the unit of measurement we were looking at. We were interested in the 450 to 4 centimeter nanometer range, and the photocell was measuring in the lux unit. So we had to establish a relationship between those two units. And the way we did that is by selecting filters that had a specific wavelength in nanometers. So on the top right, you can see those are bandwidth pass filters that we used that had a particular wavelength, and then we used that on the sensor and we saw what kind of lux it made. And once we figured out what range of blue light we wanted to look at, we had a hard time finding the appropriate filter. We found some online, and they were really hard to find, and they were really expensive too. But one of our group members, Ben, he's not on stage right now, but he found these randomly in his home at the bottom of the slide there. It's like a book of filters, and it was completely by accident. And we were just going through all the filters, and we found a filter that was satisfied the range that we wanted to look at. And we'll show you in the next slide. And here is the filter we chose, and you can see the graph there shows the range that the filter detects, and it's definitely within the range that we wanted to look at, with a little bit of a wider disparity. And you can see that on the 750 plus nanometer range, it also detects a little bit of light. So that's when we know, when we look at our results, that it's also gonna detect that kind of range. So that will affect our results a little bit. Also, we called it Project Scuba because the filter was called Scuba Blue. And in terms of execution, we basically looked at different types of filters and different types of sources of light to see what the relationships were established. And Christina will explain how we set up our initial project.
So we want to block out as much light as possible to make sure we're just detecting a solid stream of light. So we put the entire sensor and board into a small box with just a small hole for the sensor, and we used black tubing and taped around to make sure that all the light was just going to the sensor. And then for testing the phones, we did like relative range you hold your phone at. We found a box that was around 13 inches. We thought that'd be a good length. So as you see, we put the box over the sensor, and then we put some rods to hold our phone above, covered the phone to block out all light, so all we were measuring was our phone screens. So our results, we pretty much expected them. They were the same as what we expected. The top graph was just measuring our overhead lights, which were fluorescent, and UV lights with each of the filters. As you can expect, the UV lights were specifically 340 nanometers, so you can see there's way more 390 than in the overhead lights. And also Scuba was a lot greater with the overhead lights because that was the range we were expecting. However, it is larger in the UV lights because not only was it detecting blue light, but if you remember, that range, 700 plus, is UV. So that was much greater. So we weren't sure if we were detecting blue light or just a greater range of UV.
You can see in the bottom tables, we looked at the phone screen brightnesses using different filters, and you can see each of the filters kind of detects a certain amount of blue light. Also, the 750 nanometer range we were talking about earlier. And we also wanted to test how distance affects the amount of blue light that's being transmitted. And we found that if the farther you are away from a light source, the less blue light intensity, which is kind of like what you would expect, right?
Accuracy. We had a big problem with accuracy because, we could have used our graphs to become more accurate by using standard deviation, but also we could have used better code, better sensors, and better setup to improve the noise, because we don't know if we were blocking out all the light, and the filters we were using had a really large range, also with the 750. So while we think we had good results, we really don't know if they're accurate, which could be improved upon with more work in this project. To actually make it wearable, we attached an Adafruit data logging shield and soldered it to the board, which uses an SD card and a time clock. Unfortunately, because of time constraints, we couldn't get the SD card to work, which would truly make it wearable because it's not attached to a battery. And then for the photocell itself, we soldered the legs of the photocell to 2 wires and then used shrinking tube to secure the wires and fed it through a small elbow joint. So just the filter was showing, and then put a small filter over top. So essentially, it could be a small wearable device.
So yeah, the pictures on the left show the elbow joint that Christina was talking about. And you can see that the wires are fed through that tube. And it was actually like a T-shaped tube, but we sawed off the bottom so that it's more L-shaped. And then you can see that we basically just cut out the Scuba Blue filter and just glued it at the opening of one of the holes. And then you can see Christina demonstrating like how you would wear it. Yeah.
Definitely a prototype. Some issues we had, once again, with the filter was not a specific wavelength. We had a lot of noise with it. And a small problem, the tube we used in the box was conductive. We had grabbed it from the lab, and when it touched the photocell, it was messing up all the data. So that was a small problem. And then we had, once again, had difficulty reading from the SD card. And the elbow joint we used was white, which lets in a lot of light, which will affect the data.
In terms of future work we can do and improvements, we can definitely look at maybe a sensor that looked at a better measurement than lux, maybe one with nanometers. Also, we were thinking that we could make wearable sensors with also detachable filters, because the prototype we had, where we just glued the scuba filter onto the tube. Another one was, if you remember looking at our L-shaped tube, it was white. So another way for that to improve is to make it a different color, which unfortunately we didn't have, because we found that that was a factor that also influenced our results. And we could also have a better code if we could somehow tie the amount of lux that we got to a specific time. So if you were to wear the sensor out when you're out and about during the day, you can see at what time and where you were exposed to a particular wavelength, and you can see how you can help in the future, like what to avoid and stuff.
And the whole point of this, or the takeaway, is that people already know that blue light's bad for them. There's been many studies shown. You can have filters on your phone that block out the blue light. It's a well-known fact. But we think that personal details are pretty impactful. So if you had a wearable device that showed you exactly how many hours a day you're exposed to this, and we think it'll help people pinpoint a dangerous exposure and make a lifestyle change so that you can sleep better and have less problems while on your technology. And that's it. And now Philemon and Ben will present.
All right, we're the second part of the wearable team, and my name is Philemon, and this is my partner, Ben, and we're here to talk about ozone and how we try to measure ozone as in a wearable sense. So why ozone? Why are we really interested in ozone? And there's a term that we're always using in environmental health science, saying that ozone is good up high and it's bad nearby. And the reason for that is there's like two ozone systems in our atmosphere. One is the one up in the stratosphere, keeping us safe from ultraviolet radiation, the UVCs and the UVBs, which are really damaging to our skin. But the other system is the one that's forming from precursors such as NOx and VOCs. Ozone, as we know it in the health terms, that it's very highly irritant. It's actually a very good sanitizer for like water. It's very effective in killing bacteria and germs and microbes. But if you inhale it within the air, it's definitely irritant to your lungs. And one thing that I want to show is that at the bottom right, the picture that you see is the epithelial cells of our lungs, and the top one is a very healthy looking epithelial cells, while the bottom one shows you how ozone damages and affects your lung tissues. And the reason why we're interested in making into wearable sensors is because, as you can see in this picture, which was taken from Mass Air Online, there's only about 6 monitoring stations throughout Massachusetts, controlled by the state, and the closest monitor to us is in Ware, Massachusetts, which is about 15 miles away from us, and that doesn't really tell us how much we're being exposed at a personal and individual level. So we do need to make these measurements at a personal level, and a better way to do it is making a wearable sensor. And other points of making these sensors are the fact that they're very low cost. You can get a very effective and good sensor for up to $150, and you can. The more you have these sensors, the more people wear them, the more data you collect. You tend to have an increased spatial resolution, which gives you more data and more accuracy in how much concentrations of ozone are there within a specific location. And from that, you can empower people with knowledge about their surrounding and their immediate environment.
So in the last year, in the Maker class, Liz Pongratz also embarked on making an ozone sensor. And she was successful in getting a sensor hooked up to an Arduino platform and taking readings. But she struggled with the accuracy of her data and also having data that was in a meaningful range as relating to human health. So we selected a different sensor this semester, and we greatly underestimated the ease with which we thought we would be able to calibrate the sensor, get it hooked up into a working circuit, and it was more of a challenge than we had anticipated. So here is on the right, you can see that is our sensor. It's a small device. On the left, you can see we have 3 sensors hooked up to an Arduino platform with a data logging shield. So this is an wearable form factor. This is kind of a form factor we're using to evaluate multiple sensors at one time in the lab. And so this is our initial setup. We're using this box that we're trying to seal shut, and that equipment in the rack in the background is our ozone generator. And we're trying to pull basically ozone out of the ozone generator into the box and then ventilate it away. So initially, when we were having trouble getting meaningful data out of our sensors, so we were kind of perplexed as to what the origin of that problem was. We didn't know if it was our sensor or if it was if we were actually generating ozone or if we had a leak in the box that would all compromise our readings. So we really struggled for a while, not realizing that it was probably, in fact, the enclosure we were using, either the size of it or being able to get a good seal on that was ultimately what was mostly the thing we were getting stuck up on. So eventually we iterated to this setup, which is what we've had the most success with. So it's a small box meant for holding an industrial controller. And we have our sensor, and we've been powering off of a battery. So just to negate the need for a USB power and making an additional hole in the box. And then we were pulling air out of the box into a monitor, which was which is a fairly reliable, good quality ozone monitor. So this is the 3 sensors we had hooked up to the board. So essentially, when the ozone increases in our chamber, the voltage on our sensing circuit drops. So you see these peaks and troughs of our data. You can see that we're getting the best response from the blue sensor. When ozone goes high, the voltage drops low, and vice versa. You can see the green sensor seems to be not responding well, and the red sensor is responding moderately. And this graph was a breakthrough for us. We were really banging our head against the wall for a while trying to get good data. So we were really, really happy to start to see graphs like that. And then there's just another graph showing probably one of our better responding sensors. You can see graphed is the ozone level and the inverse relationship with the voltage that we're taking off the sensing circuit.
So this is still one of the good sensors that you guys saw earlier, the one with the blue line. What you see here is the green line is the exact amount of ozone that's being generated from the generator. The red line is the blue monitor that you guys saw. Or maybe I should go back. This monitor. And the black line is the voltage, as you can see. And what we saw, interestingly, was that the ozone monitor, which we thought would be very reliable because it's an expensive machine, was really not responding to the levels that were coming off of the generator. As you can see from the generator, the blue line, we were increasing it by 5 parts per billion for about an hour, and we tend to see our sensor declining over time, which is quite consistent with the generated ozone. But we already, like I mentioned earlier, we already had another monitor hooked up, which wasn't really detecting ozone until the levels got up to sufficiently up to 30 or 35 and beyond that. Another interesting idea that we saw from our sensor is that in this 2-hour span that we had going, after about hour and a half or so, our sensor tends to flatten out and kind of like increase in voltage, which, as you see, the ozone is actually increasing. We are not decreasing the ozone. That would have made sense for the voltage to spike up, but the ozone concentrations were very consistent. But at the same time, our sensor wasn't responding as we would like it. So that led us to thinking, oh, why don't we just put it at one concentration? Let's see how the sensor responds. And like we have suspected, the ozone levels, even though they were consistent, our sensor was showing this fluctuation, and there was a lot of noise. And as you can see, it steadily rises up. Now, if I didn't tell you that the ozone was about 160 parts per billion, you would think that we were changing the ozone, or maybe the ozone in this environment was actually decreasing. But that was from a consistent ozone. So this is one of the questions that we're investigating, and we will run more sensors, and we will see if these mix 2614 sensors are indeed really consistent over time.
So we did actually get a wearable prototype that we have prototyped and is working to the best of our knowledge. So I stopped by Goodwill to pick up a nice trucker cap, and I wouldn't try to get on an airplane with it necessarily, but it's a pretty simple Arduino device, and I really just wanted to do the proof of concept with a compact form factor. So we have a small Arduino, and it's writing to an SD card. It's powered off a 9-volt battery. This is our sensor here, and the circuitry is contained right below the sensor. So it's not stylish, and I don't know if I'd deploy it in the field. I mean, it helps with the lights actually, so that's great. But yeah, it was just kind of a fun little project to get it into a form factor that is actually wearable. So in the future, I guess we have to continue to do more work to try to get these sensors stable and well calibrated. And so there's definitely more work to be done. Thank you very much.